So I recently went into my loft and found some offcuts of wood I put up there years ago to dry out. Now when I brought them down, I realised they were in much worse condition than I remembered. There are rough saw cuts all over them, split edges. Most people would probably consider this to be firewood, and let's be honest, we all have pieces of wood lying around like this. But I thought, let's take these bad pieces of wood and turn them into something that's much more luxurious that you can sell. So let's get stuck in with today's video. Now, both pieces of wood are approximately the same thickness. That one is actually probably in better condition, but I've decided to work with this one because it is slightly larger, but there are multiple issues with it. The first is there are loads of saw marks all over it. Basically, it's not being cut very well, so there's a clean-up process there. But we can also see as well, the wood is actually cupped. This is where it bends with the grain, as we can also indicate by the way it spins on a center point. Now, that is obviously a process that we've got to do to flatten and clean it up. There are some splits on the end of the wood that we'll address a little bit later. You can cut them off, you can try and stabilize them with resin or glue. But the first thing we actually need to tackle is the bark on the edges. Now, some people may try and keep this as a feature, but the problem is the bark is the one thing that is likely to break off or fall off as the product ages. So we're going to address this straight away and basically clean this up and break all of the bark off, just so that we're left with the piece of wood and its veiny edges. Now, there are obviously better tools to remove the bark than a screwdriver or a chisel, but because this was already dry and aged, it was coming off pretty easy, so it just needed a little pressure to pop it off. So here is the plan. We're going to try and turn this offcut of wood into a nice whiskey serving board or serving tray. Now, I brought this glass set off the internet for about £15, so under $20. You can pick these up relatively cheap. You can even find excellent ones in second-hand stores because people throw these out all of the time, but they do look really nice. In terms of the piece of wood, I've actually realised that if we try and flatten this off and surface it on both sides, it's going to end up being really thin. So I need to find a way around that. What I'm going to do is flatten off the bottom of it, obviously, so it sits comfortable on a surface. And then in terms of the top, I'm basically going to try and keep the thickness around the edge, but then almost mill a very thin bowl in the middle of it for everything to sit inside of. This gives the illusion, obviously, it being nice and finished, but also leaving a thicker edge around it to just make it look a bit more chunky. So that is the plan. Let's see how it goes. Now, when I said about this being in bad condition and cupped, I really wasn't kidding. We're probably going to have to take around 1/4 inch, so maybe 5-6 millimeters, to get this looking something like flat. We also have the issue that it doesn't sit even, so one corner obviously is rocking, so we need to balance this up as well before we start to surface the top of it. So I'm just about to begin to surface this, and I thought I'd show you the setup. Now, obviously, the first thing you'll notice is some playing cards around the edge. Obviously, because the board is uneven, trying to get it to sit as flat as possible can be a little bit challenging. Something like playing cards are a great shim just to put in there because you can control the height quite easy. The other thing as well, obviously, because we're trying to surface the whole area of this, it can be difficult in terms of clamping it down. We can't use blue tape and CA glue because the bottom is not flat either. So I wouldn't normally do this, but I've countersunk 4 holes, one in each corner, to hold this down in place. Now, this is okay for me because I've technically got to clean these edges up later. So what I can just do is cut the little bit off that we have put the screws into. But as I say, this is how I've dealt with the situation. We can now move on and get this surface down to being flat. So we have now surfaced the top of this and got it nice and flat. The advantage to this is when we flip it over to continue working on it, we can now hold it down with blue tape and CA glue just to make life much easier. So the next steps is we're going to release this, get this flipped over, hold it back down, and we're going to trim off these 2 edges to make sure they are nice and square, and also, as I say, get rid of the holes that we had pre-drilled for the screws and things like that, basically just to clean it up. We can then move on and start working on the middle area of the tray for everything to sit inside. So the board has now been flipped over, held down with the blue tape and CA glue. We have installed the downtown Jenny, a down cut 1/4 inch bit, so we can trim the ends up. Now, the thing I had to factor in is there is a slight taper with the cut, so I've sort of had to eye it up as best I could. Now, the other thing as well is obviously there is a cup in the wood. So when it comes to working out the cutting for this, obviously I need to start at the highest point, which is this back area here. So basically what I'm going to do is take around, I don't know, 10, 12 millimeter, 1/2 inch or so off either end, just to guarantee that we get nice square edges that are parallel with each other, and also we have nice clean edges. So we'll get on and get that cut now. So both sides of this have now been cut off and machined parallel. We can see some of the spalting coming through in the wood, which is actually really beautiful. But most importantly, it now means I have the overall dimensions of the final piece, so I can decide how things are to be laid out, which is probably going to be how I've got them here. I'm going to use something like a ball nose or radius bit to machine basically a rectangular pocket out of the middle of this, probably about 5mm deep into the wood, so it looks more like a tray. And then going to do little individual pockets for each of the cups and obviously the piece in the middle, so we know exactly where everything sits within the setup. So let's move on and get that part done. So I was about to move on and start machining this, and I realised some of these splits go quite deep into the wood, maybe about 1.5 inches in. So what I want to do, just to be safe, is put a little bit of brown star bond in there and let that set, just hopefully give it a bit more strength, because I don't want to be machining too close to the edge and start to have all this flake off. So we get a bit of star bond in there now, as I say, just to hopefully give these more support. So that is the machining now finished. We need to take it off the bed, give it a light sanding. I want to clean up some of these edges where we took the bark off with something like a sanding brush, and then ultimately just give it a clear coat, really make the grain pop, and that is our serving board finished. I am considering putting some handles on this. I'm not quite sure yet. Let's see what it looks like once I've given it a sand and a clean up. So a few days later, a couple of coats of polyurethane and some sanding in between, and we have the final product. Now, finishing really isn't one of my strengths. It takes a great knowledge of the products, the material it's being applied to, and also a dust-free environment, which you rarely have when working with CNC machines. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the high gloss finish that I have achieved on this. Now, if you're unsure of the difference between something like polyurethane and varnish, there are lots of different variations out there, but generally speaking, polyurethane dries much harder than varnish. Now, whilst this isn't expected to have much wear and tear, obviously having glasses and things rested on it permanently, if that was varnish over time, they may sink into it as the varnish softens in hotter weather. So that's why I went for polyurethane on this. The other thing I also did as a bit of an afterthought was just produced a branded coin, which I'm going to go and stick right in the center of there. I possibly could have embedded this as part of the design, but as I say, it was an afterthought, and I just think adding a little touch like this makes things better. So we've taken something that most people would consider to be firewood and turned it into something that looks much nicer, more luxurious, and should be able to sell much easier. So it just goes to show what can be done with a scrap piece of wood. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that the design of this has actually turned around. I always thought the tapered end would be the front of it, but when I looked at it from the other side, I actually realised the more square edge did look nicer. So I've now flipped it around, and that is the front of the design. So I hope you found this video useful. If you did, obviously, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed if not done so already. Thank you all very much for watching. Final thanks as always goes to my patrons. I appreciate everything that you do to support me, and I will see everybody on the next episode.